Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
A marriage without love. Have you ever smiled in your wedding photos while secretly wondering if you had just made the biggest mistake of your life? I did. If someone had looked into my eyes that day instead of my smile, they would have seen fear, exhaustion, and a desperate hope that marriage could magically solve problems it was never meant to fix. What happened after that wedding changed everything I believed about love, family, and even the way I learned to speak English. The ending is nothing like what I expected, and if you stay with me, you may discover that the wrong beginning does not always lead to the wrong ending. My name is Emma, and this is my true story as I live in the United States today. When people see my family now, they often think we have always been happy. They notice our weekend walks in the neighborhood park, our children's laughter, and the little traditions we have built together. They never imagined that my marriage started for all the wrong reasons. I did not marry because my heart was overflowing with love. I married because I was tired of feeling alone. I wanted stability. I wanted someone who would stand beside me when life became difficult. I convinced myself that love could simply appear later, like spring arriving after a long winter. At first, that decision felt logical. My husband was responsible, respectful, and hardworking. He never made dramatic promises, and he rarely spoke about romance. Instead, he talked about paying the mortgage on time, saving money for the future, and creating a peaceful home. Everyone around us said those qualities mattered more than butterflies in my stomach. I wanted to believe they were right. So I smiled, nodded, and ignored the quiet voice inside me asking one uncomfortable question. What if safety was not the same as love? Life in the United States moved quickly around us. Every morning seemed to begin with coffee, traffic, work schedules, and endless calendars. We became experts at sharing responsibilities. I cooked dinner while he folded laundry. He fixed things around the house while I organized family plans. From the outside, we looked like the perfect couple. Inside our home, however, something important was missing. We could spend an entire evening together without having one meaningful conversation. Silence slowly became another piece of furniture in our living room. One habit unexpectedly began changing me. Every night before bed, I spent 15 minutes reading simple English stories aloud. I wanted to improve my pronunciation and become more confident. Sometimes I laughed at my own mistakes. Sometimes I repeated one sentence 5 or 6 times before it finally sounded natural. Little by little, I noticed something surprising. The stories were teaching me more than vocabulary. They introduced words like trust, forgiveness, patience, and courage. Those words slowly followed me into real life. I began asking myself whether I had ever truly practiced those ideas inside my own marriage. Psychologists often explain that relationships grow stronger through honest communication rather than perfect compatibility. Research has repeatedly shown that couples who openly express small thoughts and emotions build deeper emotional connections over time. I found that idea fascinating because my husband and I rarely talked about feelings. We discussed grocery lists, utility bills, and weekend errands with impressive efficiency. But we almost never asked each other what was happening inside our hearts. Looking back, I realized we had built a comfortable house without building a real emotional home. One rainy Friday evening changed everything. I came home earlier than usual, expecting another quiet night. The house was strangely silent. My husband was sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at a single envelope. His coffee had gone cold. He didn't notice me standing in the doorway for several seconds. When he finally looked up, I saw something I had never seen before. Fear. Real fear. The confident man I thought I knew suddenly looked completely different. Then he quietly said 7 words that stopped my heart. There's something I never told you before. Living like roommates. Have you ever realized that the person sitting across the dinner table from you feels more like a stranger than your own spouse? That was the moment I understood something terrifying. The secret hidden inside that plain white envelope was not the biggest problem in our marriage. The biggest problem was that I had no idea what my husband was truly carrying inside his heart. If I had known earlier, I might have made different choices. But by then, our comfortable life in the United States was already standing on invisible cracks. I slowly walked toward the kitchen table, trying not to imagine the worst. My husband gently pushed the envelope closer to me but kept one hand resting on it, almost as if he was not ready to let go. Before you open it, he whispered, I need you to know I never wanted to hurt you. My heart beat so loudly that I barely heard the rain tapping against the windows. Every terrible possibility raced through my mind. Was he leaving me? Was he seriously ill? Had he been hiding another family? The silence between us became heavier than any answer. When I finally opened the envelope, I was surprised. It was not divorce papers. It was not a medical report. It was a letter from his employer announcing another round of company restructuring. His position had not disappeared yet, but there was a real possibility that it soon would. He looked at me and admitted something that shocked me even more than the letter itself. For months, he had been living with constant anxiety, pretending everything was fine because he believed a husband should always appear strong. That confession made me uncomfortable for an unexpected reason. I realized I had been acting too. I had spent months pretending I was happily married while secretly wondering whether love would ever grow between us. We had become 2 professional actors sharing the same house. Every morning we smiled, packed lunches, discussed schedules, and wished each other a nice day. Every evening we talked about grocery prices, weather forecasts, and neighborhood news. Yet neither of us dared to ask the simple question that mattered most. How are you really? Life around us continued as if nothing had changed. Children rode bicycles through our quiet suburban neighborhood. Neighbors waved while walking their dogs. The local coffee shop still knew my usual order. America looked exactly the same outside our front door, but inside our home, everything suddenly felt different. Sometimes the most important changes happen without anyone else noticing. Around that time, I kept practicing English every evening by reading slow stories aloud. One short sentence stayed in my mind for days: honesty builds bridges. It was simple enough for English learners, yet powerful enough to challenge my entire marriage. I repeated it again and again to improve my pronunciation. Eventually, I stopped practicing the words and started thinking about their meaning. Maybe learning English was quietly teaching me how to communicate, not just how to speak. Relationship experts often explain that emotional avoidance creates distance faster than disagreement. Couples who respectfully share fears usually build stronger trust than couples who constantly pretend everything is perfect. That idea suddenly described us with painful accuracy. We had avoided conflict so successfully that we had also avoided real intimacy. We were peaceful roommates instead of connected partners. That night, instead of watching television like we usually did, we sat together in the living room with only a small lamp glowing beside us. There was no dramatic music, no movie-style speech, just two tired people trying to understand each other for the first time in years. I asked him what he feared most. He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, took a slow breath, and finally admitted that losing his job was not what terrified him the most. "I've been afraid," he said quietly, "that one day you'll realize you never truly loved me, and you'll leave." His words stole the air from my lungs because, hidden deep inside my heart, I had once whispered those exact thoughts to myself. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could say a single word, my phone suddenly rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, and what I heard next would change the direction of our marriage forever. The winter that changed me. The voice on the phone lasted less than 2 minutes, but it completely changed the way I looked at my marriage. I expected bad news. Instead, I received an invitation that seemed ordinary at first, a free relationship workshop organized by our local community center in our town. I almost said no. After all, people like us were not the kind of couple who attended workshops. We were polite, responsible, and quiet. We paid our bills on time. We smiled at neighbors. We never had dramatic arguments. But sometimes the most dangerous relationships are not the loud ones. They are the silent ones, where two people slowly disappear from each other's hearts without even noticing. I stared at my husband after ending the call. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. The rain outside had stopped, leaving tiny drops of water on the kitchen window that reflected the streetlights like little stars. Finally, I asked, "Would you go with me?" He looked surprised, almost as if he expected me to laugh at the idea. Then he quietly nodded. The workshop was held the following Saturday morning inside a bright community building filled with coffee, folding chairs, and smiling volunteers. We almost turned around before walking inside. It felt awkward admitting that we needed help. Everyone else looked confident. At least that was what I thought until we sat down and listened to the first speaker. She smiled warmly and said something that immediately caught my attention. The happiest couples are not the ones without problems. They're the ones who stop pretending they don't have any. The room became completely silent. I looked around and realized many couples were avoiding eye contact, just like we were. Maybe we were not so different after all. One exercise seemed almost too simple. We were asked to face our partner and answer one question without interrupting. What have you been carrying alone? That question stayed in the air longer than anyone expected. When it was my husband's turn, he admitted he had been terrified of losing his job because he believed his value depended entirely on providing for our family. If he failed at work, he believed he had failed as a husband. Then it became my turn. I took a deep breath before saying words I had hidden for years. I married because I wanted security, not because I was deeply in love. I expected disappointment. I expected anger. Instead, he simply closed his eyes for a second. Then he whispered, "I already knew." His answer shocked me more than anything else that day. He explained that he had sensed it long before our wedding. He noticed how carefully I chose my words whenever people asked whether I was excited about getting married. He noticed that I smiled politely instead of joyfully. Yet he hoped that building a peaceful life together would eventually allow real love to grow. For the first time, I realized something uncomfortable. Neither of us had lied. We had simply been hoping. That afternoon, while driving home through quiet American neighborhoods lined with bare winter trees, I couldn't stop thinking about a phrase I had recently practiced during my English reading routine. Feelings grow where honesty lives. It wasn't famous literature. It was just one simple sentence from a beginner-friendly English story. Yet repeating it aloud every evening had slowly changed the way I listened, not only to English, but also to myself. Language teachers often explain that fluency doesn't come from memorizing difficult words. It comes from understanding simple ones deeply. I suddenly wondered whether marriage worked the same way. Maybe lasting love wasn't built through grand romantic gestures. Maybe it grew from thousands of honest conversations that felt small in the moment. Psychologists studying long-term relationships often reach a similar conclusion. Emotional safety encourages vulnerability, and vulnerability strengthens trust. Couples who feel safe enough to admit fear often recover more successfully from difficult seasons than couples who constantly protect an image of perfection. That idea stayed with me all weekend. On Monday morning, I surprised my husband by leaving him a handwritten note beside his coffee mug. It contained only one sentence. "I'm ready to learn who you really are." He smiled before leaving for work, and for the first time since our wedding, his smile reached his eyes. I believed we had finally turned the corner. I was wrong. That evening, he came home much earlier than usual. His face was pale. He wasn't carrying his laptop. He wasn't carrying his work bag. He was carrying a small cardboard box. Without saying a word, he placed it gently on the kitchen table. Then he looked directly at me and quietly said, "They let me go." Small words, big changes. Losing a job can expose a marriage faster than years of ordinary life ever could. When my husband placed that small cardboard box on our kitchen table, I thought I already knew what would happen next. I expected panic, arguments, sleepless nights, and maybe even the end of the fragile relationship we had only just begun to repair. Instead, that ordinary Monday evening became the first time we truly stood on the same side. Looking back, I no longer believe our marriage changed because life became easier. It changed because we finally stopped fighting our fears alone. The box looked surprisingly small for something that carried so much weight. Inside were a framed family photo from his desk, a coffee mug with his company's logo, a notebook full of handwritten ideas, and the security badge he no longer needed. He carefully lined everything up on the table as if organizing them could somehow organize his emotions. Then he sat down without speaking. I didn't rush to offer advice. I didn't tell him everything would be okay. For once, I simply sat beside him. Several quiet minutes passed before he whispered, "I feel like I failed." Normally, I would have searched for the perfect response. That evening, I remembered another sentence from the simple English stories I had been reading aloud every night. "I'm here with you." Only 4 words. Easy enough for any English learner to understand. Powerful enough to change the atmosphere in our home. So I looked at him and softly repeated those exact words. "I'm here with you." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his shoulders relaxed just a little, as if he had finally received permission to stop pretending he was strong every second of the day. That moment taught me something surprising. Sometimes the simplest English sentences carry the deepest emotions. Fluency isn't always about using advanced vocabulary. Sometimes love sounds like 4 ordinary words spoken at exactly the right moment. The following weeks brought many practical challenges. We updated resumes, searched job websites, adjusted our family budget, and postponed several plans we had been excited about. Life became more careful. Every grocery trip involved comparing prices. Every purchase became a conversation instead of a habit. Yet something unexpected happened. We started talking. Really talking. Morning coffee lasted longer because neither of us needed to rush into separate emotional worlds anymore. Evening walks through our neighborhood became our favorite routine. Instead of discussing only schedules and bills, we shared memories from childhood, dreams we had quietly abandoned, and fears we had never spoken aloud. One evening, while walking through a nearby park glowing with the colors of early spring, he admitted something that made me stop in the middle of the path. I've spent years trying to become the husband I thought you wanted. His words settled heavily between us. Then I quietly answered, I've spent years pretending to be the wife I thought you needed. We both laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was painfully true. Relationship researchers often describe this as emotional authenticity. Studies suggest that couples who gradually replace performance with honesty create stronger long-term satisfaction than couples who constantly try to appear perfect. Listening to those findings later, I realized they described our marriage almost exactly. We had exhausted ourselves playing roles. Real connection only began when the performance ended. Around that time, my English practice also changed. Instead of reading stories alone, I occasionally invited my husband to listen while I practiced pronunciation. Sometimes he corrected a word. Sometimes we laughed when I stressed the wrong syllable. Those 15 quiet minutes became less about learning English and more about learning each other. One sentence from a short reading passage stayed with both of us. Small steps still move you forward. We repeated it together. Soon it became our family motto. Whenever another job application received no reply, we repeated it. Whenever doubt returned, we repeated it. Whenever the future felt uncertain, we repeated it again. Weeks later, something finally happened. His phone rang during breakfast. A hiring manager wanted to schedule an interview. For the first time in months, genuine hope filled our kitchen. He smiled the same smile I had fallen in love with only recently, not before our wedding, but after it. As he stood up to prepare for the interview, he reached for his old notebook from the cardboard box. A folded piece of paper slipped onto the floor. Neither of us remembered seeing it before. He picked it up, unfolded it slowly, and suddenly froze. His expression changed completely. Then he looked at me and quietly said, "I don't think this paper was meant for me to find today." Learning his hidden story. Some secrets don't destroy a marriage. They explain it. When that folded piece of paper slipped from my husband's old notebook, I expected another problem waiting to make our lives even harder. Instead, it uncovered a truth that had been quietly shaping our relationship for years. In less than 5 minutes, I understood why he had always seemed so emotionally distant. More importantly, I realized I had spent years judging a story whose first chapters one had never read. That discovery changed not only the way I looked at him, but also the way I understood love itself. He unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It wasn't a legal document or another letter from work. It was a faded note written in blue ink. The edges were worn, as if he had folded and unfolded it hundreds of times. "I forgot this was even here," he whispered. I stayed silent, giving him space. After a long pause, he handed it to me. The note was written by his father many years earlier. It was short. "A real man never complains. He protects his family, even when nobody notices. Be strong. Never let them see you break." I read the words twice. Then a third time. They seemed simple, but they suddenly explained so many moments in our marriage. Every time my husband hid his stress. Every time he smiled while carrying invisible pressure. Every time he insisted he was fine even when he clearly wasn't. He slowly sat down across from me. My dad wasn't a bad man, he said softly. He loved us. That's just how he believed men should live. I nodded. I could hear both respect and pain in his voice. He told me stories I had never heard before. Growing up in the United States, his father worked long hours, rarely missed a day, and almost never talked about emotions. Success meant responsibility. Love was shown through sacrifice, not conversation. If something hurt, you stayed quiet and kept moving. So when I lost my job, my husband admitted, I felt like I had become the opposite of everything he wanted me to be. Suddenly, his silence no longer looked like indifference. It looked like fear. Psychologists often describe this as emotional inheritance. Children don't only inherit eye color or height. They also absorb beliefs about love, success, vulnerability, and failure. Many adults continue living by emotional rules they never consciously chose. That idea stayed with me all day. Then I asked myself an uncomfortable question. What emotional rules had I inherited? The answer arrived almost immediately. I had always believed security came before love. Growing up, I admired stable relationships more than passionate ones. I wanted predictable happiness instead of uncertain romance. Without realizing it, I had entered marriage treating love almost like something that would automatically appear after checking enough practical boxes. Neither of us had intentionally hurt the other. We had simply been following invisible instructions written long before we met. That evening, I continued my usual English reading practice. The story was about forgiveness. One sentence seemed to leap off the page. Understanding comes before healing. I repeated it slowly several times, paying attention to each word. Understanding. Healing. Simple vocabulary. Powerful meaning. The more I practiced English, the more I noticed that the clearest sentences often carried the deepest truths. Maybe that was why slow English stories felt so comforting. They gave my mind enough time to understand both the language and my own life. The following weekend, my husband suggested something completely unexpected. Would you like to visit the lake? It wasn't an expensive trip. Just a quiet Saturday drive to a peaceful state park a couple of hours from home. We packed sandwiches, coffee, and a blanket. The weather was bright but cool, and families filled the walking trails with children, bicycles, and dogs chasing sticks near the water. For the first time in years, neither of us checked our phones every few minutes. We simply walked. We talked about dreams instead of deadlines. We laughed about our awkward first dates. We admitted how scared we had both been before our wedding. As the sun began setting over the lake, he gently reached for my hand. It felt strangely new. Not because we had never held hands before. Because this time there were no masks left between us. Then, almost shyly, he smiled. I think. He stopped. What? I think this is the first time we've actually been on a real date. I laughed so hard that people nearby turned to look at us. And for the first time since our wedding day, I realized something extraordinary. I wasn't forcing myself to stay. I wanted to. Just as we stood to leave, his phone vibrated. It was the hiring manager. he answered with a hopeful smile. Less than a minute later, that smile disappeared. He slowly lowered the phone, looked at me, and quietly said, "They didn't call about the interview. They called because someone gave them my name." Choosing love every day. The most surprising opportunities rarely arrive with perfect timing. When my husband ended that phone call, I expected another disappointment. Instead, he stood completely still, staring at the screen as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Someone had recommended him for a position he had never even applied for. It sounded like incredible luck, but what happened next made me realize that hope often begins quietly, long before we recognize it. Looking back now, I don't think that phone call saved our marriage. It simply revealed that we had already started saving it ourselves, one honest conversation at a time. He took a slow breath before speaking. "The hiring manager said one of my former coworkers personally recommended me." I smiled immediately. "That's wonderful." But he didn't smile back. "I don't understand why," he admitted. "I thought nobody even noticed my work." For a long moment, we sat together in the car overlooking the peaceful lake. The evening sunlight reflected across the water, and families nearby were packing picnic baskets before heading home. Everything around us felt calm, yet inside my husband, another storm had begun. A few days later, he attended the interview. I spent the morning trying to stay busy. I cleaned the kitchen twice, folded laundry that didn't need folding, and practiced reading one of my favorite slow English stories aloud. The sentence for that day was simple. Believe actions, not fears. I repeated it again and again. Every time anxiety entered my mind, I read the sentence one more time. Language experts often explain that repetition helps new words become natural. I discovered something similar in life. Repeating healthy thoughts slowly replaced old fears. It wasn't magic. It was practice. That afternoon, my husband returned home carrying no cardboard box this time. Instead, he carried 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of me, sat down, and smiled. They offered me the job. For a second, I forgot to breathe. Then I jumped up and hugged him so tightly that we both started laughing. It wasn't just because he had found work. It was because I could finally see confidence returning to his eyes. Later that evening, while celebrating with homemade dinner instead of an expensive restaurant, I asked the question that had been quietly sitting in my heart. "Did they tell you who recommended you?" He nodded. "My former manager." "The same manager from the company that let you go?" "Yes." That surprised both of us. During the interview, the hiring manager explained that although the company had reduced staff because of business changes, his former manager had repeatedly described him as calm, dependable, and someone who always helped others succeed. "You weren't dismissed because you weren't good," I quietly said. "You were caught in circumstances." He looked down at his coffee. "I spent months believing losing my job meant losing my worth." His words reminded me how easily people confuse events with identity. Psychologists often point out that many people attach their self-worth to a single role, employee, parent, spouse, or provider. When that role changes, they mistakenly believe their value disappears too. Yet healthy relationships help people separate who they are from what has happened to them. That lesson became part of our everyday life. Instead of waiting for special occasions, we began choosing small moments of connection. Every Sunday morning, we walked through the local farmers market. Every Wednesday evening, We cooked dinner together without television playing in the background. Every Friday night, we asked each other one meaningful question before going to sleep. What made you smile this week? What worried you? What are you hoping for next? The answers slowly became longer. The conversations became deeper. And something wonderful happened. Our house no longer felt quiet because we had nothing to say. It felt peaceful because we no longer feared saying anything. My English practice also became part of our routine. Sometimes I would read a short story aloud while he prepared dinner. Occasionally he corrected my pronunciation. Other times, he simply listened. One evening, I read a sentence that made both of us stop. Love grows through daily choices. He looked at me and smiled. I think that's true. So do I. It was amazing how one short sentence could describe our entire journey. Not dramatic romance. Not perfect compatibility. Just ordinary choices repeated consistently. Weeks later, life finally began feeling normal again. His new job was going well. We laughed more often. We argued less. The future no longer felt frightening. Then, on an ordinary Saturday morning, while cleaning the hallway closet, I found a small unopened gift box hidden behind an old winter blanket. There was no birthday. No anniversary. No holiday. Just my name written carefully across the top in my husband's handwriting. Confused, I carried it into the living room. He looked at the box, smiled nervously, and quietly said, I bought that a long time ago. But I never had the courage to give it to you. A family begins to bloom. Sometimes the smallest unopened box carries the biggest surprise. As I stared at my name written across the lid in my husband's careful handwriting, my mind raced through 100 possibilities. Was it an apology he had never delivered? A forgotten anniversary gift? A goodbye that he had almost given me during the darkest days of our marriage? I had no idea that opening that tiny box would become the beginning of an entirely new chapter in our lives. Looking back now, I realize love doesn't suddenly arrive one magical morning. It quietly grows while you're busy surviving ordinary days together. I sat beside him on the living room sofa, turning the little box over in my hands. The wrapping paper looked slightly faded, as if it had been waiting for months. My husband smiled nervously. I bought it before I lost my job, he admitted. Then everything happened so fast. It never felt like the right time. I slowly untied the ribbon. Inside was a delicate silver necklace. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't extravagant. Hanging from the chain was a tiny heart engraved with one simple word. Hope. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I wanted to give it to you after our first wedding anniversary, he said softly. I wanted to tell you that even if our marriage wasn't perfect, I believed we could build something beautiful together. Tears filled my eyes. Not because of the necklace. Because I suddenly understood that while I had been questioning whether love could grow, he had quietly been believing it all along. I reached across the sofa and held his hand. This is the first gift that's ever made me cry, I whispered. He laughed. I was hoping for a happier reaction. We both laughed together, and somehow that laughter felt lighter than any we had shared before. Life continued moving forward in its ordinary American rhythm. My husband settled into his new job, and I continued working while keeping our evenings reserved for family time instead of endless distractions. We cooked together more often, explored local parks on weekends, and even started planting flowers in our small backyard. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was something much better. It was real. One Sunday afternoon, while we were assembling a bookshelf we had bought from a local furniture store, I suddenly stopped what I was doing. "I've been feeling tired lately," I said. He smiled without looking up. "We've both been busy." "No. Different tired." He slowly looked at me. Our eyes met. Neither of us spoke. A few days later, we found ourselves sitting together inside a doctor's office. The room felt unusually quiet. When the doctor smiled and said, "Congratulations," I instinctively reached for my husband's hand. We were going to have our first baby. On the drive home, neither of us turned on the radio. We simply smiled. Sometimes happiness is too big for conversation. That evening, while practicing my English reading as usual, I came across another beginner-friendly sentence. "Every new beginning starts with hope." I smiled immediately. The word hope. The same word engraved on my necklace. I read the sentence aloud 3 times. My husband listened from the kitchen before quietly repeating it with me. Those little English reading sessions had become part of our relationship. They were no longer only about pronunciation or vocabulary. They reminded us that simple words often carry life's greatest truths. Researchers studying healthy marriages frequently note that shared daily rituals strengthen emotional bonds. The activity itself doesn't need to be extraordinary. Reading together, sharing coffee, taking evening walks, or simply asking about each other's day can slowly increase trust and connection. Looking back, I realized our strongest memories were rarely expensive vacations or perfect celebrations. They were ordinary moments that became meaningful because we experienced them together. Months passed quickly. Our daughter arrived on a bright spring morning surrounded by smiling nurses, soft hospital lights, and more emotions than I knew were possible. The first time my husband held her, he didn't say anything. He simply cried. I had never seen him cry before. Not when he lost his job. Not during our hardest conversations. Not even on our wedding day. Watching him gently rock our tiny daughter in his arms, I realized I was seeing the truest version of the man I had married. That night, after the hospital became quiet, he leaned over our sleeping baby and whispered something I will never forget. "I promise you'll always know it's okay to talk about your feelings." In that single sentence, he quietly ended the emotional inheritance that had followed his family for generations. My heart felt completely full. I believed our greatest challenges were finally behind us. But life has a way of testing hope when you least expect it. A few months later, during what should have been an ordinary pediatric checkup, the doctor reviewed our daughter's chart, became unusually quiet, and gently said, "I'd like to schedule a few additional tests, just to make sure everything is developing as expected." The room suddenly felt colder. My husband squeezed my hand. Neither of us asked the question we were both thinking. The truth about real love. Nothing prepares you for the moment a doctor says, "We just want to run a few more tests." Those simple words echoed in my mind long after we left the pediatric clinic. My husband and I smiled politely, thanked the doctor, buckled our daughter into her car seat, and drove home through familiar American streets that suddenly felt completely unfamiliar. The traffic lights still changed from red to green. Children still played in front yards. Coffee shops were still busy. The world looked exactly the same, yet inside my heart everything had changed. It was in those uncertain days that I finally discovered what real love actually looks like. And it was nothing like the version I had imagined when I got married. The following week felt longer than an entire year. Waiting is exhausting in a way that nobody talks about. There was no problem we could immediately solve, no checklist to complete, no decision that could speed up time. We simply had to wait for another appointment while trying to live normally. That turned out to be much harder than I expected. Every little thing suddenly seemed important. Was our daughter sleeping enough? Why did she seem quieter today? Was I imagining problems that didn't exist? My mind kept asking questions that had no answers. One evening I caught myself staring at her while she slept peacefully in her crib. My husband quietly walked into the room and stood beside me. "She's beautiful," he whispered. I nodded without taking my eyes off her. "I'm scared." "So am I." For the first time, neither of us tried to hide our fear. There was something strangely comforting about sharing it. Psychologists often explain that emotional support doesn't remove uncertainty, but it reduces the feeling of facing uncertainty alone. Couples who openly acknowledge fear instead of denying it usually experience lower emotional stress over time. That idea suddenly made perfect sense to me. Our situation hadn't changed, but carrying it together somehow made it lighter. During those anxious days, I continued my evening English reading practice. Some people asked why I didn't stop. The answer was simple. Those quiet 15 minutes became my safe place. One short sentence from a beginner-friendly story stayed with me all week. One day at a time. Only 5 simple words. I repeated them slowly, focusing on my pronunciation. Then I realized I wasn't just practicing English anymore. I was practicing patience. Whenever my thoughts raced toward frightening possibilities, I gently reminded myself. One day at a time. Surprisingly, my husband started saying it too. Soon it became part of our everyday conversations. When we worried about the test results. One day at a time. When we felt overwhelmed. One day at a time. Simple language. Powerful comfort. A few days later, we returned to the pediatric clinic. The waiting room felt unusually quiet. Parents smiled at their children while secretly checking the clock every few minutes. I realized we were all carrying invisible worries. When our daughter's name was called, my heart began beating so fast I could hear it. The doctor carefully reviewed the new results before looking up with a gentle smile. "I have good news." I immediately reached for my husband's hand. The additional testing shows that her development is within a healthy range. We simply wanted to monitor a few measurements more closely because every child grows differently. I closed my eyes. The breath I had been holding for days finally escaped. My husband laughed softly. Then, without caring who was watching, he hugged both me and our daughter at the same time. Walking back to the parking lot, the sunlight somehow looked brighter than before. Not because the world had changed. Because we had. That evening, while sitting together on our back porch watching the sunset paint the sky above our quiet neighborhood, I turned to my husband. "Do you remember why I married you?" He smiled. "I think so. I married you because I wanted security." He nodded. "And now?" I looked toward our daughter sleeping peacefully through the living room window. "Now I stay because I love you." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for my hand exactly as he had done beside the lake months earlier. No dramatic speech. No perfect movie moment. Just silence filled with understanding. At that moment, I realized love hadn't suddenly appeared one magical day. It had quietly grown through ordinary breakfasts, difficult conversations, evening walks, job interviews, shared fears, bedtime English stories, and countless small choices that neither of us fully appreciated at the time. Real love isn't always lightning. Sometimes it's sunrise. Slow. Steady. Almost invisible until suddenly the whole sky is bright. As we sat there enjoying the peaceful evening, my husband's phone vibrated again. He glanced at the screen. His smile faded. "It's from my younger brother," he said quietly. "He never calls this late." He answered immediately. After listening for only a few seconds, he looked at me with worried eyes and softly whispered, "I think our family needs us tonight." Looking back without regret. The phone call lasted less than a minute, but it reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. A strong marriage isn't tested when everything is going well. It's tested when someone else's storm suddenly becomes yours. As my husband quietly said, "My brother needs us." I could see the old version of him beginning to return, the man who believed he had to carry every burden alone. This time, however, our story would not repeat itself. Without realizing it, we had already become different people. And the next 24 hours would prove just how much love had grown from the wrong beginning. We quickly packed an overnight bag, buckled our daughter into her car seat, and drove across town under the soft glow of streetlights. My husband's younger brother had recently gone through a difficult divorce. He had always been cheerful at family gatherings, always making everyone laugh, but over the past few months he had slowly withdrawn from everyone. That evening he had finally admitted he wasn't doing well. When we arrived, his apartment was unusually quiet. The television was on, but nobody was watching it. Takeout containers sat unopened on the kitchen counter. He smiled when he saw us, but it was the kind of smile that disappears before it reaches the eyes. "I didn't know who else to call," he admitted. My husband immediately hugged him. No advice. No lectures. Just a hug. Watching the two brothers standing there reminded me of the note from their father, the one that said real men should never complain or let anyone see them break. For years they had both carried that invisible rule. Yet here they were, quietly proving that true strength sometimes begins with asking for help. We stayed for hours. The conversation moved slowly, just as healing often does. We talked about work, family, childhood memories, and the pressure many people feel to appear successful all the time. Eventually, my husband's brother admitted he had spent months pretending everything was fine because he didn't want anyone to think he had failed. "I forgot that I wasn't alone," he whispered. Those words stayed with me all the way home. Psychologists often describe social support as one of the strongest protective factors during stressful life events. People who maintain close relationships generally recover more effectively from emotional setbacks than those who isolate themselves. I didn't need a research paper to believe it anymore. I had watched it happen inside my own family. The next evening, after putting our daughter to bed, I returned to my familiar English reading practice. The short story that night contained one sentence I had never noticed before. "You grow stronger together." I smiled. It was another simple sentence designed for English learners. Easy grammar. Clear pronunciation. But the meaning reached much deeper than the vocabulary. For months, those quiet reading sessions had become more than language practice. They had become moments of reflection. Each short sentence seemed to arrive exactly when I needed it most. I realized that learning English slowly had also taught me to slow down emotionally, to listen before reacting, to understand before judging, and to appreciate simple words spoken with sincerity. A few weeks later, our family gathered for a neighborhood picnic in a local park. Children chased bubbles across the grass while adults shared homemade food and easy conversations. Watching my husband laugh with our daughter as she tried to feed ducks near the small lake, I suddenly remembered the woman I had been on my wedding day. She was searching for certainty. She believed security would automatically create happiness. She thought marriage was a destination. I almost wanted to walk over and hug that younger version of myself. Not because she was foolish. Because she was afraid. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her something she couldn't possibly understand back then. Love isn't found. Love is built. One ordinary conversation. One apology. One patient evening. One difficult season. One shared dream at a time. As the sun began setting over the park, my husband walked toward me carrying our daughter on his shoulders. She laughed so loudly that nearby families smiled at us. He looked at me with the same gentle expression I had first noticed after he lost his job. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying long enough for us to become who we are now." I felt tears gathering in my eyes again. I almost didn't. I know. Neither of us needed to say anything else. Our story spoke for itself. Later that night, after everyone had fallen asleep, I noticed an email notification appear on my phone. The sender's name immediately caught my attention. It was from the wedding photographer who had captured our ceremony years earlier. The subject line read, "I found something you never received." I opened the email with trembling hands, completely unaware that one forgotten photograph was about to change the way I remembered the day our marriage began forever. Love can still grow. One forgotten photograph made me cry harder than my entire wedding day. When I opened the email from our photographer late that night, I expected a technical mistake or an old receipt. Instead, attached was a single image that had somehow never been delivered. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Then I zoomed in. Everyone else was smiling toward the camera, but my husband wasn't looking at the photographer at all. He was looking at me. Not with uncertainty. Not with obligation. He was looking at me with quiet hope. In that instant, I realized something that completely rewrote the story I had been telling myself for years. I stared at the photograph for several minutes. I had spent so much time remembering my own emotions on our wedding day that I had never stopped to imagine his. I remembered my fear. I remembered my hesitation. I remembered silently wondering whether I had made the right decision. But in that photograph, my husband wasn't thinking about himself. He was watching me with the gentle expression I had come to know years later. The same expression he wore when he encouraged my English reading. The same expression he wore while holding our daughter for the first time. The same expression he wore after finding a new job. Hope had been there from the beginning. I just hadn't recognized it. The next morning, while sunlight filled our kitchen, I showed him the photograph. He smiled immediately. "I've wondered about that picture," he admitted. "You remembered it?" "Of course. What were you thinking when it was taken?" He laughed softly before answering. "I was praying." I blinked. "Praying?" I was hoping that one day you wouldn't just choose this marriage. He paused. I hoped you would choose me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I walked around the kitchen island and wrapped my arms around him. I do, I whispered. He looked confused. I choose you. Not because life had become perfect. Not because we never struggled. Not because every dream came true exactly as planned. I chose him because we had already walked through uncertainty together. We had survived silence. We had survived fear. We had survived unemployment, disappointment, difficult conversations, sleepless nights with a newborn. And countless ordinary days that quietly shaped extraordinary love. Researchers who study long-lasting marriages often reach a surprisingly simple conclusion. Lasting relationships are less about finding the perfect partner and more about consistently responding to each other with kindness, trust, and emotional availability. Looking back over our journey, I finally understood why. Love had never arrived all at once. It had grown through hundreds of tiny choices that seemed insignificant at the time. That evening, after putting our daughter to bed, I opened my favorite English reading book one more time. The final story contained a sentence that felt as though it had been waiting for me since the very beginning. Love grows where people never stop choosing each other. I read it slowly. Once. Twice. Then my husband quietly repeated it beside me. Those simple English practice sessions had become one of my favorite parts of everyday life. They reminded me that meaningful communication isn't about using difficult words. It's about speaking honestly enough for another heart to understand. If you're learning English today, don't be afraid of simple sentences. Sometimes the shortest sentences stay with us forever. I'm here. Thank you. I understand. Let's try again. Those are not only useful English expressions. They are also beautiful ways to build a stronger relationship. Today, when neighbors see our family walking through our neighborhood park, laughing over weekend breakfasts, or celebrating small moments together, they probably imagine our marriage has always been easy. They don't know the truth. They don't know that I married for the wrong reason. They don't know that love arrived slowly instead of instantly. And honestly, I'm grateful for that journey. Because if everything had been perfect from the beginning, I might never have learned what real love actually means. Real love isn't a dramatic feeling that appears overnight. It's a decision repeated on ordinary Tuesdays. It's choosing patience after a disagreement. It's listening before defending yourself. It's believing in someone's future even when they no longer believe in themselves. If my story leaves you with only one thought, let it be this. A wrong reason can begin a relationship. But only daily kindness, honesty, forgiveness, and courage can help love truly grow. Maybe your story isn't finished yet either. Maybe today is simply the chapter where hope quietly begins.